So we have the heart locally with the local sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia, local feedback loop, lots of information flowing back and forth here, lots of co-regulation happening just local to here. If you place your hand on someone's sternum and you press or squeeze, obviously in a safe way, hopefully, you're going to be talking and causing a whole bunch of regulatory perturbations in this system. And that'll only partially make it into their conscious experience. Next, what's happening is there's information flowing into the brainstem via the vagal nuclei, the spinothalamic tracts, and that information is being filtered by the reticular activating system and the thalamus. And it's from here that you have information flowing into the insula. I've got so many colors. Flowing into the insula, which is sometimes thought of as, which I love this kind of reckless term called the limbic sensory cortex. And the insula is at least partially responsible for affectively mapping our bodies. So when we say, I feel grief in my heart, and I feel butterflies in my stomach, and I feel, et cetera, something about emotionally locating, locating emotions in the body, probably you would not be able to do that magic trick without the insula and the anterior insula in particular. So think about ACG and insula as two key limbic structures that are interacting with the heart, pericardium, diaphragm, etc., and receiving that information on an emotional and affective level, right? Informing the heart about your emotional state, right? Boy, man, when you see, somebody you have a crush on, and it's really going strong, and then you see them suddenly in a room you weren't expecting to, boo, what happens to your heart? Whoa, 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 whoa. Why? Why does that happen to your heart? It's because of some massive change in the state of your limbic system that is driving a sudden behavioral change in the heart. So what I'm telling you in this model is that emotional process is informing a physiologic change down here via the limbic system and the ACG insula in particular. There's also information flowing from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex in the brain. So I know that I'm off camera now again. So the thalamus is also sending information about this system to the parts of the brain which we can more readily map as our bodies. So some information about the state of your heart physiologically is accessible to you consciously. You can probably get better at this, right? Some people are better at sensing their own heartbeat, their own heart state, although it's not necessarily a good thing if you're better at it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Some of that information is landing in the limbic system, and you may or may not be conscious of that process. You may be conscious of a change in your sense of the world, a change in your emotional state that might be driven by a change in your heart state. But you may or may not be conscious of the limbic influence. An example of this is with the insula. It turns out that there are people who lack certain sensory fibers which terminate in the sensory cortex of the brain. So there are people who have no conscious sense of touch. They're very rare, but a few of them have luckily volunteered to be experimented on. Thank you. And the experiments are ethically performed, and they go something like this. Person who has no conscious sense of touch, they do not know consciously when you are brushing their skin somewhere. They sit in a blindfolded chair, and someone takes a paintbrush and gently brushes either their thigh or their forearm, right? And the person is asked, am I brushing your thigh or your forearm? Now, if they can see it, of course, they'll be able to tell. If you ask almost any other person, they'd be able to tell you whether or not they're being brushed on their forearm or their thigh, because the sensory information is ending up in the sensory cortex of the brain. A person who lacks this kind of fiber still has insular interoceptive fibers terminating. So they lack this, but they retain that. When that's true, here's the crazy thing. A person will have no conscious experience of touch as far as what they can name with their language, right? What they seem to be aware of, except if you put them in a forced choice paradigm. If you say, hey, buddy, I know you don't consciously perceive the touch, but you got to choose. Which is it, forearm or thigh? Just make a choice. The people will almost always choose the correct thing. They will correctly identify whether they're being brushed on the thigh or the forearm without a conscious recognition of that. That's one of those really key, insightful experiments of the last few years, because it tells us that the insula is influencing our decision processes in ways that are not noticeable to us in consciousness. And this might serve as some inspiration for our perception of the heart piece. Are there ways that the heart influences our perceptions without us being conscious of those perceptual influences? Are there ways the heart influences our decisions without us being conscious of it? And then what does it look like to become more conscious of it?